Dorothy Singer has had some really bad luck. I mean, her first two husbands both died before she reached 50 years old. And of course, these things can happen. You know, some people go through life on easy mode, and it can take a really long time before they ever experience a real loss. But for other people, like Dorothy, they get more than their fair share. And unfortunately, that's just life. But in 2017, 6 years after her second husband's death, something really strange happens. Her third husband, Butch Singer, suddenly stops answering his phone. He stops showing up for work, and when people ask Dorothy where he's at, she says, "Oh, we had a fight and he just kind of like ran off somewhere." So, okay, sure, I guess that kind of makes sense. But then 6 weeks pass and still no one's seen him, no one's heard anything from him, and his family is really starting to panic. They're calling the cops now, calling everyone who knows him, asking where he might be. And meanwhile, Dorothy is just telling everyone, I wouldn't worry about it. He's just staying away this long to mess with me. Whatever that's supposed to mean. It's definitely a really interesting reaction from somebody who's already lost two husbands in their life. I mean, you'd kind of expect her to be panicked, to be frantically searching for him, but she wasn't. And when Bunnell police finally start investigating, they're going to find out exactly why. Now, before we get in today's case, I want to let you guys know there is mentions of domestic violence as well as self-harm. So if those are triggering topics for you, as always, please just make sure you guys are taking care of yourself. And honestly, this case has a lot of really weird and bizarre things that happen from one individual specifically. Like, as I was researching this and going through this case, I was really like, that's a really weird thing to do and say. So interested to see what you guys think about this one, but let's not waste any more time and get straight into it. So our case takes place in early 2017 in Bunnell, Florida. And there's a woman named Dorothy Singer. She's 52 years old at the time of this case. Now, a little bit about her. She used to work at a gun manufacturing facility, so she would be around these huge AR-15s and M16 rifles, which are like these pretty big guns. But perhaps it's like not that weird being an American and from the United States and whatnot. I'm sure everyone there is quite used to guns. For me, that's a little bit of like an odd job, but otherwise seemingly normal. And what was interesting was that her coworkers described her as someone who is very sweet and soft-spoken. So I think just in my mind, thinking of someone who's like a really soft-spoken, kind and timid person, but handling these like huge guns, just to me feels like such a jarring contrast. But anyhow, she was married to Charles Singer, who was 48 years old. And throughout this case, I'm going to refer to him as Butch because most of his friends and family would call him Butch. It was like his nickname. Now, Charles was legally blind, so he did wear glasses and it helped with his vision, but he was legally blind, which meant that he needed benefits and assistance from the government, but he was still a very independent guy. He actually had a job as a roofer as well, but not working on the roofs directly because that would seem like a huge safety hazard to me, but more so someone who would drive people around and like run errands and did administration work, those types of stuff. Now, Charles and Dorothy, they were married for 3 years, but they were together for around 4 to 5 years. Butch and Dorothy would have what you would describe as a really turbulent relationship. They would fight a lot, especially when alcohol was involved. Their fights would get seemingly way more intense. Now, what's even more interesting is the fact that this wasn't Dorothy's first marriage. She had two previous marriages before she met Butch. So, this case, just keep in mind, it was hard to find a lot of specific information about things. So, for example, her first husband, we don't know his name, but he died of a heart attack. Yeah, natural cause death and whatnot. But it was just so weird because her second husband, Everett Barnes, who was age 39, before he passed away of a really sudden drug overdose. Now, there was a bit of an investigation that happened with her second husband's death, and Dorothy specifically told police that he did have a long history of alcoholism and would also take non prescribed prescription pills. So it kind of seemed like, okay, I guess it makes sense that he had an overdose, but it's just so weird to have two husbands. Now you're on your third, and your first two husbands die, like of a natural cause or like very suddenly. Like, To me, that seems like such a weird and huge coincidence, right? Now, in late January, early February 2017, Dorothy and Butch are living their normal lives together in their trailer in like quite an isolated property. So, Florida, it can be quite hot and humid there. So, where they lived had a lot of lakes passing through and whatnot. And you might be wondering like what kind of lifestyle they had, to what extent did Butch like need assistance or daily care, especially from his partner. But he was actually very, very independent. As I mentioned, he has a job that he works on his own. But just to talk a little bit about what it means to be legally blind, as we know, blindness isn't just one condition, it exists on a spectrum. Some people can have partial vision, some people struggle to see certain things like light, shape, movements. I mean, there's just so many different ways to be blind, which was a little bit of a weird phrasing. Sorry about that, but hopefully you guys get what I mean. Like, Butch was legally blind, but he could still see things in limited detail. And I emphasize this because it's going to be a really important fact throughout this case. So, anyhow, this is just to say that Butch wasn't some, helpless person who would be endangered without constant help from others. In so many ways, he lived his life very independently. Like, he had his own job and the day to day routine with Dorothy. He would like cook and clean and do a lot of things on his own as well. He was like very, very capable. So, if Butch really was a fully blind person who needed a service dog or a lot of help from Dorothy, it might have been more, immediately alarming when in early February, he just stopped going to work and stopped replying to calls and messages from his family. Like, it almost seemed like he dropped off at the face of the earth. So, what exactly happened, early 2017? On February 8th, suddenly, Butch doesn't show up for work, which is really weird for him because he's always at work. He never would call in sick. And even if by any chance something would happen, he would always let his employer know. But this time, he didn't say anything. No one had heard from him. And this was also around the last time that Butch's sister, Elizabeth Ellis, had spoken to Butch. So that was also the last day she had heard from him. And we know that's the last day that Butch was seen because he was last seen at Cody's Corner convenience store, which is a convenience store that you would go to every single day or very often. People would often see you there. I'm sure we all have one store that we go to in our neighborhood. So that was like the last place he had been seen. Then, weirdly enough, the next day on the 9th, Dorothy also doesn't show up for work. But she as well doesn't tell her employer, like, hey, I'm sick or I'm not coming in today. She doesn't say anything. No one hears from her until the next day on the 10th, where Dorothy finally calls him work and tells him, like, hey, I'm not going to be in today. But what's super weird, even though at first she didn't tell her workplace that she wasn't going to come in or as to why or what was going on, she actually calls Butch's workplace, which was the Flagler County Roofing. And she basically tells his supervisor that Butch, put his hands on me. We had a really bad argument, and I told him, like, hey, I'm going to give you an ultimatum. You either get out of the house or you're going to jail. And she basically told his employer that, Butch did voluntarily leave the house and then went to go and live with his sister, and that pretty much Butch would not be returning to work. Now, let's note the fact that trauma dumping on your husband's boss is a very strange thing to do, but everything about it is just so weird because why didn't he call in work himself? Why did she then miss work, not say anything, but then call his workplace to let them know what was going on and about their personal details? Like, it's all like a little bit weird, right? But what's weird about this whole thing is not just what Dorothy was saying to, Butch's employer and like how she was kind of acting. The weirdest thing was that she had claimed that Butch went to move in with his sister because they're quite close. They would speak every day, but this wasn't the case. Obviously, Butch's employer wouldn't know anything about it, but Elizabeth, she was like, well, actually, that's not true. Butch never moved into my place. I actually haven't heard from him since early February, and I don't know where he is. I've tried contacting him, I've tried texting him, especially because Butch is visually impaired, so he would oftentimes use this like a speech recognition software to talk to his family. So he would like speak into his phone and it would write out what he was saying and that could be sent as a text message. So you can assume that oftentimes when people are texting with Butch, when they read messages from him, it's not going to sound like how it is written. It's going to sound like it's spoken, if you get what I mean. But anyhow, during that same time between February and March, where, Butch is kind of gone, Dorothy has been like telling everyone really weird and different versions of stories. So she told Butch's employer, hey, we got into a really bad argument. He laid hands on me. I'm giving him an ultimatum. Also says that he went to move in with his sister, but his sister's like, actually, that's not true. I haven't heard from him. Pretty much throughout this whole time, Butch's family doesn't know where he is. And like the biggest concern is just that they haven't really heard from him. Of course, he's a grown man, like he can be going out and living his own life, but it's just weird that Dorothy can't keep her story straight and she's kind of like trauma dumping and word vomiting to all of these different people around her, like that's in their life, and telling everyone all of these different things. So for Butch's family, they were concerned, obviously, and they were really confused as well. But then one day, suddenly out of the blue, after some time of not hearing from Butch, he texts his family and he tells them basically, hey, what Dorothy is saying is true. We got into a really bad argument, but let me clear some things up. Actually, I moved out of state. I now went to another state and I got a new job and I'm fine. You guys don't have to worry about me. But when his family received that text message, something about the way it came off to them was just so weird because as I said before, Butch has a really specific style of like how he speaks to his family because of the fact he's using these speech recognition software. And when they read this text message, it didn't sound like Butch speaking to them. It sounded like someone else had texted on his behalf. That's what it felt like for them. So, can you imagine someone in your family is missing for a couple of weeks? Their partner is saying all of these different stories and not keeping it a private matter. First of all, they're like going around to people in their neighborhood and like telling them their personal life. They don't know what's going on. And then suddenly you get this really weird text out of the blue. But unfortunately, nothing really comes from it. They get this text and they're kind of like, okay, like it doesn't feel right, but like, what could they really do? He had claimed he had moved out and he's having issues in his personal life with his wife. For his family, this wasn't really enough to be like, okay, like we need to go to the police and do something about it. They just had this weird feeling eating away at them, but like nothing really happens until over a month passes, right? Of no one has seen Butch. People have maybe heard from him from these weird texts, but no one has seen him. And then finally on March 23rd, this is when Elizabeth Ellis decides to file a missing persons report. I think Elizabeth got to a point where she was like, okay, now this is really weird to me. He's only given us this one text. That sounded a little weird. I have a really bad feeling. A month has passed. Like I'm gonna file a missing persons report, essentially. Now, we don't know why it took so long, but I'm going to assume she kind of like hit a point where she was like, I'm going to trust my gut feeling. She knows her brother. They grew up together. They were decently close. Like, I have a feeling that something is really wrong. So I'm just going to bring this matter to the police now. And not only that, she thought it was weird that his wife didn't really do anything and wasn't doing anything, and everything just felt super abrupt as to why their relationship just collapsed out of nowhere and then he moved out of state. Like it all just felt really sudden. But anyhow, now with the missing persons report filed, the Flagler County Sheriff's Office basically began their investigation like straight away. And they do the, standard procedure, checking phone records, checking bank activity, checking on Dorothy, seeing what she's saying about all of this. And there were a couple of things as they were looking through some stuff that stood out to them. So first of all, we have the phone records. When they took a look at it, they could actually see that Butch's phone has never once left Dorothy's vicinity. That means that she has his phone. It's on her. And they know this because, of course, they have like cell phone towers that ping the location of the two phones, and they can see that it's been with Dorothy this whole time. Like it has never left the States. Then their bank activity that they looked at, they could see that even though Butch has, left state or like gone somewhere else, all of these purchases that have been made in the past month or so have all been made in, Florida, Bunnell, where Dorothy and Butch live. at their Dollar General store, at Ace Hardware. And all of these purchases were made quite early in February as well, around the same time that people stopped hearing from Butch. And when I took a closer look at the things that were being bought, it was things like bleach, carpet cleaner, camouflage top, mothballs. Let's be honest, it's all looking really suspicious and almost like way too obvious here. Like, come on. Phone records, bank activity, and you have receipts of things that you've bought that all are like kind of pointing to like, red flags. Obviously, for detectives, they were like, okay, we have to go check up on Dorothy Singer and, question her, check her house maybe if she lets us, because she's starting to look really, really suspicious. So basically, so far, it's looking, less like a disappearance. It doesn't really seem like Butch has left the state voluntarily after a huge fight. Just with how things have played out and like the concerns from his family, all of this is starting to look like preparation, preparation by Dorothy. But what exactly was she preparing for? We don't know, but we're going to find out. On April 3rd, this is when detectives decide to go to Dorothy's property. Now, they don't have any sort of arrest warrant during this time. They don't have a warrant to search the property because even though they did look at certain records of things, they didn't have enough evidence to obtain a warrant. So they kind of go to her property hoping that she will let them in and take a look around. Now, at first, when they approach the door and whatnot of this, keep in mind, it's not a house, it's like a trailer. So when they come to the front door, Dorothy answers and they say, hey, like, can we take a look around your property? At first, Dorothy was really hesitant. She was like, like, I don't know. But then, she ends up saying, yeah, okay, fine. Like, you guys can look around. So they do a quick search in the trailer, but nothing is too much there. I mean, it's not the biggest place to have to look around. What was actually the big thing was the backyard because there's just so much space and they were on like an isolated property, like surrounded by a lot of trees and a lot of nature. So they end up going to the backyard. And what really sticks out to them is like a John boat that's flipped upside down. And if you don't know what a John boat is, just imagine like a small fishing boat. Because remember, we're in Florida where a lot of people would go fishing. And it was covered with debris and like wood pallets and mothballs. Mothballs. And they could see like a little camouflage top from like underneath where the boat was flipped, like peeking out a little bit. So this was the first thing that they had noticed. 'Cause can you imagine going into a backyard and it's like relatively empty besides this like one flipped over boat and you're kind of like, huh, that's weird. Why does this almost look intentionally placed? Why does the pile on the boat look unnatural? It doesn't look like things have naturally just fallen on it. It looks like someone has placed those things there. But of course, at this point, they don't have a search warrant. So, they end up do having to leave the property, but they keep all of this in mind. Then, 4 days later, they do return to the property, and this time they have a search warrant. But even though they have a search warrant, Dorothy wasn't around. And it doesn't really matter because they can still technically, look around the property and whatnot. If you have a warrant, like the person doesn't actually have to be there. But it was just weird that when they showed up, she wasn't there. She wasn't around. Maybe she was, out of the house and like going to go and do something, had errands. We don't know. But anyhow, they head back to that same place where they saw the flipped over boats and, they lift it up and what they see is like this tarp that's like clearly covering something. It's like wrapped something up. So they unwrap it and then they find him, the man that has been missing for a month. Butch, there. He's dead, but he has like a pillow under his neck and he has a lot of these various items that are like covered all over him. And at this point, it's been a couple of weeks. So the state of his body, it's been through, the decomposition process. There isn't like flesh that's intact, but it's not completely skeletal yet. And this was kind of the point where detectives find his body and like they get that sinking feeling in their chest where they're like, oh no, we're going to have to let his family know that we found him, and he's unfortunately dead and not in another state, living a different life with a new job like Dorothy had claimed. But I think what stuck out to investigators the most when they found his body was just the items that were next to him. So I've mentioned mothballs a couple of times. And if you don't really know what that is, which I don't blame you because I didn't really know what that is when I first heard of it, I think it's more of an American thing, but it's essentially something that has a really strong like chemical odor. I think it's oftentimes used to repel insects, and it was just placed all around his body. So detectives were thinking, this seems intentional. Like they don't know for sure 100% who could have done this yet. Well, obviously, all eyes are on Dorothy because she's looking suspicious as heck. And they thought that maybe she placed all of these bowls around him as an attempt to cover the odor. But you can imagine the fact that Florida is really hot, Florida is really humid, which means two things. One, the rate in which decomposition happens is a lot faster in a more humid and hot environment. Two, the mothballs doesn't actually cover any smell. It just adds another smell on top of it. So you can smell his body, but it's just mixed with this awful chemical smell. And it's just such a honestly disrespectful and like really not nice way to like leave someone body like that. He wasn't even buried. Perhaps I did not make that clear at first, but his body wasn't even buried underground or anything. It was placed above ground, wrapped in a camouflage top. Yeah, a camouflage top. As if the thought process was like, surely this camouflage top will camouflage his body. Whatever kind of thought process that is, I don't know. This is what I mean by this case, guys. Like, there are just some things that happen and some things that this killer does that is just so strange to me and like really stick out to me. But anyhow, this is now like not a missing persons case anymore. Now this is a confirmed homicide case. Soon after the body was recovered, the autopsy took place, and they can see that Butch was shot 5 times. He had 5 bullet hole wounds, and he was shot with a .22 caliber firearm. And most notably, he had 4 shots to the head and 1 to the chest. And he was most likely killed around February 8th. So the last day that anyone had seen him, the day that he didn't show up from work, was the day that he was killed. Obviously, like autopsies and forensics are not always going to be 1,000% sometimes, but they were pretty confident that this was around the time frame as to when he was killed. At this point in the case, we're kind of between April to May, like the investigation has taken place. They have his body, they have some evidence that Dorothy has been really strange throughout all of it, but they don't know where she is. She's gone. She wasn't there at the house when they had the arrest warrant. She wasn't there when they found his body and everything. The family has been informed at this point in time, and it's just absolutely heartbreaking for them. Just having someone that you love, like just drop off the face of the earth and you don't know what happened to them or where they are. And then you have all of this hope, waiting for that text or waiting for them to show up one day, only for the police to let you know instead that they found him, but not in a place where you think he might be. Now, to make it really clear where we are in terms of the story and the investigation, so investigators at this point were able to confirm that Dorothy was using Butch's phone to impersonate him. She was the one who sent out those weird text messages to family, trying to pretend, I'm Butch, I'm alive, I'm well. It was Dorothy. Hence why they were also able to see that both of their phones were together all the time on Dorothy's person, and as well as the fact that she was buying all of these really weird supplies to possibly clean up the crime scene, the mothballs, the top, the cleaning supplies. And then, of course, they found those same items on his body as well. And when they first initially spoke to Dorothy at the beginning of this case, she just had so many inconsistencies. She was telling people that they had an argument, that he took all the stuff and then left the state and got a new job. Now, Dorothy also told detectives, before they found the body and everything, when he was still missing and when she was first questioned, she told them, like, oh, I wouldn't worry about him. He's intentionally like hiding just to mess with me. What? Like, what does that even mean? Like, at this point, throughout everything that we've seen from Dorothy, she just does not strike me as a very smart person. Her behavior is very, very weird. How can you continue to use your husband's bank card, like his ATM debit card, after you've claimed he's left the country? You have his phone on you. You're telling his employers and the people around you all of these different stories, all of these different inconsistencies, using, a camouflage top and a mothball to cover his body that's not even buried, that you've left in your backyard. Like, this is like the worst crime ever. Like, she didn't even try to get away with anything, right? But the biggest concern about all of this is that Dorothy is gone. and they don't know where she is, and they obviously need to find her so they can arrest her before she maybe hurts somebody else or hurts herself, or it's just something bad could really happen. But in a really weird twist of events, they find her car. In this car, it's clear that it's been left behind by her. All they find inside are two empty pill bottles, and each of the two bottles has one single pill left in it. And they also find a letter that was stuck onto the dashboard of the car, like on the front of the car where the window is, just a letter that was left there. And guys, that's not even the weirdest part, okay? Because all of this is trying to indicate to something, right? But when they read the letter, it was addressed directly to Detective Annie Conrad, which was one of the main detectives in this case. And when they read through it, they could see, okay, this is a suicide letter. Like, she's claiming that she's gonna go and kill herself. And she's not even addressing family members or like, writing this emotional piece to say, tell my family I love them, like I'm going to miss them. No, it was addressed to the detective, and it basically wrote down the events of what exactly happened on that day. On the 8th of February, the last day that Butch was seen by anybody. In the letter, she writes that they had basically gotten into a huge fight and things had happened, but basically Butch dragged her by the hair, was dragging her all across their property. Then he was about to shove her into a hog pen and he was threatening her. He had the gun, he took it out. They were struggling for it. A shot goes off by her foot. She takes the gun and she shoots him in self defense. Self defense. I didn't want to kill him. I didn't mean to kill him, but he was threatening to kill me. I was scared for my life. I had to do it. And I regret this so much. So now I'm writing this suicide letter, addressing it to the detective of this case, and I'm letting you know I'm going to kill myself. Basically, that was the whole premise of the letter. So obviously they keep this and they're like, oh my God, like this isn't good. This is not a good situation to be in. But they were very smart. These detectives were smart. They didn't let this letter throw them off course and go, well, case closed. I guess we can't look for her now. No, they kept their eyes on her because they had this really weird, sneaking suspicion that perhaps this letter isn't her, killing herself, but rather trying to buy some time for her to escape the country. With this in mind, the fact that there's two possibilities right now, either Dorothy really did kill herself or she was using that note, as a way to find time to escape. The search for her was on. So police is scattered everywhere. They're all around the county. They're also being placed, on certain highways that one would need to go to in order to get to the other state. And on May 9th, on State Road A1A, and just to give you a visual of this highway, because I had to look it up and see, what does this highway look like? I can't lie, it's actually pretty scenic. It's along this like beautiful island coastline, and it's actually the highway that connects Florida to Georgia. And the police were waiting there when they suddenly catch Dorothy, just as she was trying to leave the country. Sorry, not leave the country. It's still the United States. It's one country, but leave the state to another state. And they were like, we knew it. You didn't try to commit suicide. You were just trying to run away and obviously avoid law enforcement. But she was arrested and she didn't really put up any fight. She didn't speak back. She didn't say anything when she was arrested. Now, of course, a big applause to law enforcement here for the time that they, dedicated to catching her and like waiting it out. But it wasn't just luck where they happened to be at the right place at the right time and they happened to catch her. What had actually happened was that Dorothy was planning an escape with her friend. I think her friend had some sort of safe house that they were both going to go to, but her friend called her out. Her friend contacted the police and told them, hey, this is where Dorothy is going to be. This is where she's going to go at this time on this day. Like, you guys need to be there. So, applaud to the friend as well. Now, a quote I wanted to share with you guys that I thought was a little bit funny that was actually from the police sheriff. He said, when you see what our detectives did to take this from a missing persons case to proving that it was murder to making an arrest, this case is made for a Dateline episode. Now, I've never seen Dateline. Maybe some of you guys have, but I thought that was just a funny quote because it really goes to show how bizarre and weird Dorothy's choices were. They weren't just weird to me or to you guys, us listening and learning the story, but it was so strange to the people who were also involved in this case. Anyhow, when Dorothy was arrested, she was charged with first-degree murder, and her initial court appearance was on May 10th. So she had to first come into court on a first degree murder charge, and this actually took place via a video conference from county jail. So just to let you know, like, this is not a trial that's happening right now. This was a proceeding just to determine a couple of things about her case. First of all, she was held without bond. And she also claimed that she did not want to hire her own private attorney. So she opted for a public defender instead. We don't know why or what her thought process was. This is just what happened. And then eventually the case moved on to trial. So the trial begins in early May 2018. And the prosecution, they focus on the fact that Dorothy deliberately shot Butch multiple times. We know that autopsy reveals that he was shot at least 5 times, one to the chest and 4 to the head. But the biggest thing about his autopsy results wasn't just the fact that he was shot multiple times. There was one specific gunshot wound that stuck out to them. And that was this one bullet hole that was on the very top of his skull, like at the back here. And the prosecution said, well, based on these autopsy results and where he was shot behind the skull, it implies that this victim was likely shot while he was laying down, while he was prone, which means he was also very vulnerable. This shot came from behind. If you're shot from behind, how could that be self-defense? How could you shoot someone from behind if you're in an active struggle? They would be in front of you. So they established this in court and they said, this almost seems like an execution style killing. And that was such a strong piece of evidence against Dorothy's case. And they had mentioned that this was an intentional cover up. Not only the gunshot wound on Butch's head, indicates to an execution style killing, she also bought materials ahead of time and after his death to not only prepare to cover up his body, but also as an attempt to clean up the crime scene and conceal the odor with mothballs, using the top to cover his body. And she had basically gone around telling everybody all of these different stories as to what happened. Like, this all shows very calculated and planned behavior. Like, this wasn't something that had just suddenly happened in the spur of a really intense moment. That was the prosecution's main focus in the trial. Now, not only that, they also had Dorothy's, suicide letter where she was claiming self-defense, and she basically told them what had happened and said, oh yeah, there was a struggle between us. A shot went off by my foot and then she shot him, right? That she had claimed. But they highlighted the fact that Butch was shot 5 times, and the gun that he was shot with can only have 5 bullets in the chamber at one time. So if Dorothy is claiming that one shot went off beside her foot, do you see what I'm saying here? Like, the math is not mathing. It's not making any sense, because that means that 6 shots would have gone off. But that is not possible, which means that Dorothy's claim is probably BS. So all of this was undermining her self-defense theory. And not only that, they had another piece of evidence that really helped the prosecution's case and emphasized the fact that this wasn't self-defense. So 2 weeks after the murder had happened, one of Dorothy's daughters actually moved into her trailer, and she was sleeping in a bed that had blood smeared on the headboard. Yeah, which is just really eerie and creepy and so weird. And Dorothy's daughter had nothing to do with anything. She was oblivious to all of this. She had no idea, that her mother had killed Butch. But only later on throughout the investigation, and after they had searched her property and they were obviously doing forensics everywhere, they took note of the fact that there was still dried blood smeared on the headboard. If he was shot outside, like Dorothy had claimed, how is there blood on the headboard? Also, noting the fact that Dorothy didn't see it and clean it up, which is just wild to me. But this further, helped the prosecution's case that Butch, possibly, very highly possibly, when he was killed, was laying in bed. Maybe he was asleep and Dorothy just executed him, basically. So this whole claim and her whole story, as we know that she lies and makes up a lot of these weird stories based on all the random inconsistencies she was telling everyone earlier, they were like, no, we think you executed Butch. He was laying in bed. He was unarmed, completely oblivious as to what you were going to do, that's actually so bad. That's actually so bad, like killing someone in their sleep. Now, Dorothy's defense, they did their best with what they could, with all of this evidence against Dorothy. But Dorothy did take the stand in her own trial and she wanted to testify in her own defense. And she claimed for many of the years that her and Butch were together, she was suffering from really bad domestic abuse at the hands of him. He was very violent, very physically aggressive with her. And when she went up onto the stand, she again told the events of what happened on that day of February 8th. And she expanded on the story a little bit more. She said way more stuff, things that she didn't even mention in her suicide letter. So she said what had started this whole situation, it was a normal day, things were happening. And she went out to the porch and she sees that Butch killed her kittens. They're just laying there slaughtered. This triggered her. I mean, I think I would trigger anyone to see like dead kittens on your porch. But in her mind, she was like, oh, he's doing this intentionally to provoke me, killing my kittens. So, of course, she goes over to confront him. An argument happens. They're fighting, they're yelling, and then things start to get physical. He grabs her and starts dragging her around the property by her hair, and she's screaming in pain. Then he drags her over to the hog pen and tries to shove her in there and threatening her and saying all of these things like, I'm going to keep you here and I'm not going to feed you food. And then he was like going to pull out a gun. And as he pulled it out, she grabbed it. They were fighting back and forth. Gunshot to the ground. She grabs the gun and shoots him multiple times as self defense. When she was on the stand, she said, I was petrified. I was terrified. He took me outside, dragged me outside by the hair, and it was just this huge struggle. He was going to put me in the hog cage, the trap, so I couldn't eat. We are struggling, and the gun just goes off. So, with her testimony, the defense highlights past domestic violence that happened between the couple. Not only do we have her testimony as to what happened that day and how this, alleged domestic abuse kind of accumulated over time. And then this event was kind of the main thing that kind of popped off after all of this years of abuse. And there were other people who took the stand to kind of, further this narrative. So one of Dorothy's daughters, Harmon, testified, and she said that back in February, the same month that Butch was killed, that she saw that her mother had hair that was like pulled out of the scalp, that she was missing hair in a certain spot. And she also had this huge cut down the back of her cuff. And she had also said she recalled to another past event back in 2013 when she said that Dorothy was receiving cancer treatment and that she had firsthand witnessed Butch kicking and stomping Dorothy on her kidneys. And apparently it was so bad that she had to step in herself and like basically put a stop to it and tell him like, hey, you need to stop that. And that happened before they got married. So this is while they were still in the dating phase. So she really highlighted the fact that this abuse happened for a really long time before they even got married, like years and years and years before. But the thing was, even with this claim of domestic abuse, not from just Dorothy herself, but from her daughter, this was significantly undermined during trial. Dorothy had made another claim and she said that one time she got injured by Butch really badly and she took a bunch of photos of it and sent it to her mom. And most interestingly, though, even though Dorothy had claimed this, when her mom took the stand during the trial, she said that she received no such pictures. So we won't know for sure what is actually true or not. Then there was another testimony from like an acquaintance, not really close family member or friend, who also lived in the same area as Dorothy. And they had claimed that after Charles was killed, like kind of timeline wise, he saw Dorothy in her car outside of the, Cody's Corner convenience store that we know of. And she had really bad physical injuries, including a black eye. So these were just a couple of things that corroborated Dorothy's story of suffering from domestic abuse. And there was also one more thing. There was a police report that was made 3 years earlier to all of this. And there was an incident where Butch was harming Dorothy like pretty badly. The police were involved in everything. And the only consequence from that, though, was him having to go to an anti-domestic violence class. So there wasn't actually, at the end of the day, there wasn't actually enough evidence, to take her claim of self-defense. And that self defense was the outcome of years and years of long term domestic abuse. It wasn't enough for her to justify killing Butch in self defense because of those things. So on May 18th, the jury deliberated for 3 hours and 45 minutes. and they came out with a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder, so life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, after Dorothy's conviction of a life sentence, she did file for an appeal. So in 2019, a couple of years after this whole thing, the Fifth District Court of Appeal, they had to uphold her conviction, but they reordered a new trial. And this was because when they looked into it, they saw that there was actually an error that happened during her trial where the defense team wasn't given enough time to prepare this new piece of evidence that was introduced to them by the prosecution. And that was specifically the DNA evidence they found on the headboard, the smeared blood. So, because of this, they were going to proceed with a full retrial, but instead Dorothy did end up accepting a plea deal in May of 2020. So she pleaded no contest to a reduced charge of a second-degree murder with a firearm, which means this also reduced her conviction from life in prison to now sentenced to 32.5 years in prison. This means she was in her 50s at this time. It is possible for her to come out at the end of her, serving time and be in her old age and still kind of live out the rest of her life, not in prison. Now, it's very clear throughout this case that Dorothy killed Butch, and no one deserves to go out like that. No one deserves to not even have a proper burial. And just the way he was killed is absolutely brutal. There is no deny with any of that. She killed him. However, this case is also a little bit interesting in the fact that she had claimed that she was abused by him for so many years, and that this moment was that pinnacle moment where she kind of snapped and defended herself. And unfortunately, he died in that process, right? That was Dorothy's story. That's what she was really sticking with. But it's so hard to believe someone who did all of these weird things after killing him and claiming all of these weird and different things. If it was truly self defense, why didn't she seek some help? Or why did she go out of her way to make up all these stories and buy all these items and cover up his body? Too much of it just seemed so calculated and premeditated, especially with the cover up after, that people are not going to take her claim of self defense seriously. And people are also not going to take her claims of domestic abuse seriously as well. But all of that aside, may Butch Singer rest in peace. He really, of course, did not deserve any of that. His family as well. I can't imagine what they would put through all of this. But I can't help but ignore some of the things in this case that are just a little bit of a food for thought. And it kind of relates to bigger issues in our real world, where it's a lot of victims of domestic abuse, sometimes they go through years and years and years of abuse and suffering, and one day they snap and they defend themselves and they end up killing their abuser. And there is so many different stories of this. But I think what, in my opinion, matters to me the most, situations that have to be upheld in a court of law and, there has to be some sort of legal process. To me, what matters the most is what you do after and how you act after the fact. I feel like that is what stands out to us the most. But anyhow, all of that aside, Dorothy's past marriages as well, I can't shake the fact that there's no way this can be some weird coincidence. She had two previous husbands who died coincidentally, and now her third she killed. That's so weird if you think about it, right? What's that saying? They say once is an accident, two is a coincidence, three times is a pattern. But anyhow, what do you guys think about this case? I feel like there's a lot to discuss here, a lot to digest. This was a pretty, this was an interesting case to go through. I hope you guys liked listening to this one. And as always, if you guys found this video informative, if you enjoyed it, please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. Feel free to comment down below. I'd love to have a conversation with some of you guys, and I'll see you guys in the next video.